All right, welcome to Chapter 7, Human Movement Science. Movement is described in three dimensions that are based on planes, which include the sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes. And these just help us to have common markers and common language of where things are placed and what plane of movement we're in. Osteokinematic describes the observable movement of a limb, and whereas arthrokinematic describes the movement taking place at the joint itself. So osteokinematic is a limb being moved, arthrokinematic is the joint itself. Movement is described using biomechanical terminology that is universal to all professions in the allied health industry, and that just makes it common language, right? It's something that everyone, if we're talking about something being superior or inferior or distal or proximal, that everybody can know. It's a little bit easier to stay on the same page as saying like nearer or closer or above. Those are a little bit too open to interpretation. The sagittal plane is an imaginary line that bisects the body into left and right sides, and movements in the sagittal plane include flexion and extension, and as well as plantar flexion and dorsiflexion of the foot and ankle. So sagittal plane, although it cuts us left and right, the movements that happen in the sagittal plane are forward and back. They're forward and reverse. The frontal plane bisects the body to create front and back halves. So that's where the frontal plane lives. Movements in the frontal plane include abduction and adduction of the limbs relative to the trunk, lateral flexion of the spine, and then eversion and inversion at the foot and ankle complex. So the frontal plane cuts front and back, but it moves left and right. And then the transverse plane bisects the body to create upper and lower halves. Movements in the transverse plane include internal and external rotation for the limbs, right and left rotation for the head and trunk, horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction of the limbs, and then radial ulnar pronation and supination. So again, then the transverse plane cuts us top to bottom, but everything in this plane moves in a rotational way. Motions of the scapulae, being multiple scapula, we have two of them, include scapular retraction, scapular protraction, scapular depression, and scapular elevation. So those scapulae, because they're not really fixed, besides they're attached by muscles, and they are able to move freely in a lot of different planes of motion and allow you to have some stability with the shoulder. They're really there's a lot of cool functions for the scapula. When we think through the types of muscle actions, they're described as isotonic, isometric, and isokinetic. So isotonic muscle actions can really be broken down simply into concentric and eccentric phases. And really those are just, we're seeing some movement, right? It's concentric is the muscle is shortening, eccentric, the muscle is lengthening. Isometric being, we're seeing a contraction, but there's not any movement that's actually happening. It's just a fixed contraction. And then isokinetic just means that the speed of the movement stays constant. Muscles can play the role of agonist, synergist, stabilizer, or antagonist depending on the movement being performed. So just be mindful that the muscles can play a lot of different roles. It just depends on the movement that's being performed. Closed chain movements anchor the body to the ground or an immovable object, whereas open chain movements involve the distal limb moving freely in space. And so these are just, again, it's like just a simple universal terminology to help us understand maybe the benefits or pros and cons of doing one type of movement or not. For example, a closed chain, if we think about the quad and like a knee extension, closed chain quad extension, knee extension would be a squat coming out of like the bottom of a squat. We're going to be foot placed, anchored on the floor, but we're extending our knee to, get ourselves to come up. Whereas an open chain version of that movement would be a leg extension. We're seated, our foot is free, open in space, and we're extending at the knee, at the quad, but it's an open chain movement. Placing a muscle in a shortened position or lengthening a muscle beyond optimal length may reduce force output. This is really just because the optimal length is the position in with maximal overlap of our actin and myosin filaments. So at the smallest level, if we're too extended or too shortened in a muscular position and an anatomical position, it can be hard to produce force. And then the same as it goes all the way down to the cellular level. Those actin and myosin filaments are just not in a good position to create a contraction. The stretch shortening cycle involves 3 phases, which include the eccentric phase, the amortization phase, and the concentric phase. So this is mostly where you would think of this most commonly, I think, in plyometrics, in jumping, where if say I'm going to do a vertical jump, I'm going to go down, I'm going to preload, that would be my eccentric phase. Then there's a transitional point where I have to stop going down and then I need to transition to come back up. So that transition, that stop, that is your amortization phase. And then when I come back up through the movement and I jump explosively, that is my concentric phase. So that is your stretch shortening cycle, involves 3 phases. The term force couple is used to describe muscles that work in a synergistic function around a joint. Right? They're using the coupling of their forces to help each other to create a movement. The local muscular system involves muscles that generally attach on or near the spine and provide stability for the lumbopelvic hip complex. So that's going to be a lot more centralized. It's not going to be, my bicep, my triceps, those are not considered local muscular system muscles. Things like my rectus abdominis, my internal and external obliques, my multifidus, my quadratus lumborum. Some of these muscles that are more around my spine and my trunk and my lumbopelvic hip complex are going to be considered in that local muscular system. And then the global muscle system can be broken down into subsystems, right, which include the deep longitudinal, posterior oblique, anterior oblique, and lateral subsystems. So these are just our anatomical guidelines that help us to see that that when it comes to muscular anatomical areas and movements, that really nothing is on an island. That's why we're looking at these subsystems and seeing that they are the deep longitudinal system. It stretches over an area of your body. Similar with the posterior oblique, anterior oblique, and lateral subsystems that we see. There's connections throughout your body. The subsystems describe the integrated function of muscle groups to transfer force for complex multi-joint movements and stabilization of the human movement system, right? There's integration throughout these muscle groups. The amount of force produced by the human movement system relies on not only muscular recruitment, but also the lever type of the joint that is moving. And levers, right? These can be challenging to remember, but they're really simple, right? Think of them as 3 ways. There's a first class, a second class, and a third class levers. And third class levers are the most predominant levers in the human body. So just keep that in mind. Most of them are third class because third class levers are very advantageous and allow us to produce a lot of force. Muscle synergies describe the cooperative function of multiple muscles recruited by the nervous system to complete a given movement pattern, right? So there's synergistic help because there's cooperation of the multiple muscles. Proprioception is the intrinsic awareness of movement and bodily position in space. And that's, if you hear proprioception, a lot of times it's going to be in the same breath as balance. Feedback can come from internal or external sources and aids the process of motor learning. Obviously, we can feel and be aware of what a movement feels like and is producing for us internally, as well as external sources and aids being potentially like seeing yourself in a mirror or having a coach give you feedback. Motor learning is the integration of motor control processes with practice and experience, leading to a relatively permanent change in the capacity to produce skilled movements. Right? So it's important to recognize that not everybody's going to be perfect at movements or learning skills right off the bat, and it's going to take some time to really, fine tune the movement patterns and learn efficiently. And then we just have a list of our important concepts, and obviously this is not an exhaustive list, but it's very important for you to have an understanding, an idea of your anatomic locations, and as well as some of our muscle actions, agonists, synergists, stabilizers, antagonists, closed chain, open chain exercises, length tension relationship, altered length tension relationship, reciprocal inhibition, altered reciprocal inhibition, and then force couple relationship being our most important ones. So we'll just kind of go through these a little bit. So probably easier for you to do these while you're visualizing them and seeing things on a skeleton or on a human body. But medial, when we think of something being medial, it's relatively closer to the midline of the body. Lateral would be relatively farther away from the midline or towards the outside of the body. Contralateral and ipsilateral, we're thinking of these ones. Contralateral is positioned on the opposite of the side of the body. So if I said my right foot will be planted on the ground and I'm holding the weight on the contralateral side, that means I'm going to be holding the weight in my left hand. Right foot on the ground, contralateral. Ipsilateral, just being the same side. So I would be right foot on the ground and holding the weight in my right hand. Anterior and posterior, right? Positioned, anterior is going to be the front side of my body. Posterior will be the back side of my body. Proximal and distal, we're referring to a center point. So proximal would be my shoulder. Distal would be my hand. And so it's always, it's in reference to another identified point. So we can say the shoulder is proximal to the hand, but the elbow is proximal to the hand as well. And then the elbow is distal to the shoulder. Inferior and superior, again, we're using a reference point. So inferior being below an identified reference point. So, we could say that my sternum is inferior to my clavicle and the clavicle is superior to the sternum. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, right? So these are just flexion and extensions that are happening at the ankle. So dorsiflexion means that the top of the foot moves closer towards the shin. I'm pulling my toes and the top of my foot up. And then plantar flexion would be extension occurring at the ankle. I'm putting my toes down. I'm pushing down into the ground, almost like a plantar flexion would be a gas pedal. Dorsiflexion would be pulling my foot off the gas pedal. And then our most important ones, we're going to go through these muscle actions, right? So isotonic, isometric, and isokinetic. We kind of talked about these before, but isotonic, the force is produced, muscle tension is developed, and movement occurs through a given range of motion. Isotonic muscle actions are subdivided into concentric and eccentric muscle actions. Isometric, muscle tension is created without a change in muscle length and no visible movement of the joint. So we're contracting, but there's no movement that's visible. And then isokinetic, kinetic being the speed side of things, the speed of the movement is fixed and resistance varies with the force exerted. So this requires a sophisticated training equipment and is often seen in rehab or exercise physiology laboratories. You're not going to see a ton of isokinetic unless someone's really has a good control of their movement in space. And then agonists, right? We can think of agonists as the primary muscles providing force for a movement. Examples would be the glute max is the agonist for hip extension. So if I'm doing a hip extension or a squat, the glute max is the agonist. It's the primary mover. The anterior deltoid is an agonist for shoulder flexion. So if I'm doing a front raise, that's the anterior delt is my agonist. The biceps brachii is the agonist for elbow flexion for biceps curls. And then the triceps brachii would be the agonist for elbow extension for like a tricep pushdown. Synergists are helpers, right? Muscles that assist agonists to produce a movement. So some examples might be if we see the hamstring complex and the erector spinae are synergistic with the glute max during hip extension. So we saw that the glute max was the agonist, the primary mover. Then we'll see that the hamstring complex also provides some hip extension, but it's not the primary mover. Similar with the biceps curl, the brachioradialis and the brachialis, some of these muscles that are in our forearm, the crossover, they also have some of that function of elbow flexion, but they're not the primary movers, they're the synergists. Similarly, then we can see that the triceps brachii assists the pec muscles during a chest press, and the biceps brachii assist the lats during a pull-up. Stabilizers are the muscles that contract isometrically to stabilize the trunk and the joints as the body moves. So examples of this may include the transverse abdominis. This is your body's deep abdominal muscle. It's kind of like your body's weight belt. The internal obliques and the multifidus, deep muscles of the spine. These all stabilize the lumbopelvic hip complex during hip extension. They help to keep your spine straight and your core in a good position while you're doing that hip extension movement. And then similarly, like we were talking about the chest press and the pull-up, the rotator cuff is a primary stabilizers for that. And a good way to remember the rotator cuff is that they are the sits muscles. So you have your supraspinatus, your infraspinatus, your teres minor, and your subscapularis. Sits. Antagonists, muscles on the opposite side of a joint that are in direct opposition of agonist muscles. So it's important to note that even though if I'm doing a biceps curl, my triceps is the antagonist and still is playing a role in that movement. Oppositely, if I'm doing a biceps curl, the tricep becomes the antagonist. If another example would be if the hip flexor complex is antagonistic to the glute max during hip extension. So even though I'm coming out of a squat and I'm extending my hips and squeezing my glutes forward, the hip flexor complex in the front side of my hips is antagonistic, and it also, again, plays a role in me being able to complete that movement well. And then one more example is that the latissimus dorsi is antagonistic to the delts during a shoulder press. And then we just have a couple examples of some closed chain exercises. Closed chain, all right, we would see push-ups, pull-ups, squats, and lunges, right? We're all here fixed to an anchor point, whether it be a push-up to the ground, a pull-up to a bar, a squat, or a lunge here also to the ground. Open chain exercises potentially could be biceps curls, a lat pull down because, again, it's not a fixed position. That bar is moving. A bench press, the bar is moving. Leg curls and leg extensions, it's open. Important to think about the length tension relationship, right? The resting length of a muscle and the tension the muscle can produce at this resting length. So that goes back into thinking about your muscular contractions in the actin and myosin sliding filament theory. If we see that like we have our myosin, our actin and our myosin, if the actin is latching on and then the myosin cross bridge is trying to contract, if they're too short, if they're too lengthened, if there's an altered length tension relationship, it's going to be hard for me to still make a contraction because I'm already at my lengthened, my fully contracted point. When I'm at a good resting position, then they can, have optimal. They're in an optimal position to produce that force. So the length tension relationship at a resting position is important to note. And then an altered length tension relationship is, like we said, it's either there's too far away, it's too long, or it's too short, and it's going to be harder for us to produce the same amount of force in that position. That's an altered length tension relationship. Reciprocal inhibition is when an agonist receives a signal to contract, and its functional antagonist also receives an inhibitory signal allowing it to lengthen. When we have an altered reciprocal inhibition, this occurs when an overactive agonist muscle decreases the neural drive to its functional antagonist. So an example of these two would be your hip flexors being overactive, right? That would be an overactive muscle that is decreasing the neural drive to the glutes. So if the hip flexor is pulling your hips, your pelvis into an anterior tilt, then what happens is, because that's now in an anterior tilt, we have an altered length tension relationship, and the glute is no longer able to function or to get the same amount of drive as you would like it to. So the fix for that is to get the hip flexors to be back into the position that we want them to be in, so that the glute can function and drive fully the way that it is in a most optimal length tension relationship. A muscle imbalance, right? This is just like I described, that's when muscles on each side of a joint have altered length tension relationships. So that would be an example of that being in that altered, in an imbalanced position. Thinking through an integrated performance paradigm is to move with efficiency. Forces must be dampened eccentrically, stabilized isometrically, and then accelerated concentrically. So we have to have proper abilities in all three of these areas. A force-couple relationship is just the synergistic action of multiple muscles working together to produce movement around a joint. And that's where some of the complexities of things come into play, especially we talked earlier about like the scapulae. The scapulae being, because it's going to, when I do an overhead press, or if I do a pull down or a pull up, I'm not strictly using my glenohumeral joint. I'm not just using my, that ball and socket joint. My scapula is gliding upwardly and downwardly to assist with that movement. So there has to be a proper synergistic action of those muscles, and helping those joints to work together. And then we think of our levers. Like you said, third-class levers are the most common ones, but some easy ways to think of these, right? First-class levers have the fulcrum in the middle. They're like a seesaw. So nodding the head is an example of a first-class lever, just going up and down. It's on a fixed point. Boom, I'm producing force upward and downward, and the top of the spinal column, my neck, is acting as the fulcrum. Second class levers are like wheelbarrows, right? They have a resistance in the middle with the fulcrum and effort on either side. So similar to a load in a wheelbarrow where the axle and the wheel are the fulcrum points, the body acts as a second class lever when one engages in a full push-up or a calf raise. So not a ton of examples of these, but the calf raise, it's a pretty advantageous lever to be in as well. Now the third class levers, these have the effort placed between the resistance and the fulcrum. The effort always travels a shorter distance and must be greater than the resistance. So most limbs of the human body operate as third class levers. And an example of the third class lever is the human forearm, right? If we think of the elbow being the fulcrum, the effort is applied by the biceps brachii and the load is in the hand. So they're both on the same side, but they're going in opposite directions. So the effort is applied by the biceps brachii, the load is in the hand, and then the dumbbell is being curled by the biceps. Another example is the standing hamstring curl, which is pretty much just like it's your lower body curl, whereby the knee joint is the fulcrum, hamstring muscle is the resistance, is the effort, and then the resistance is coming from the ankle. And then just a few more terms. Motor behavior is the motor response to internal and external environmental stimuli. Motor control is how the central nervous system integrates internal and external sensory information with previous experiences to produce a motor response. Motor learning is integration of motor control processes through practice and experience, hopefully leading to a relatively permanent change in the capacity to produce skilled motor behavior. Motor development is a change in skilled motor behavior over time throughout the lifespan. And then we have internal and external feedback. Internal feedback is a process whereby sensory information is used by the body to reactively monitor movement and the environment, whereas external feedback is information provided by some external source, such as a fitness professional, your coach, your personal trainer, a video, a mirror, a heart rate monitor to tell you what your heart rate is at, or something to supplement the internal environment.